So this is just going to be a small little video because I didn't want to make the previous video too long. I try to stay under 30 minutes. But anyway, I was trying to compare HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, to the Christian churches and like how both deal with immigrants and refugees coming to the US and maybe like comparing numbers and stuff. But with HIAS, I honestly tried looking for like books and articles on the organization and really didn't find much. I only found a book that was like published in the 50s about the organization, but that's not really that helpful because the organization was set up in the late 1800s to deal with Jews escaping from Russia during like pogroms and stuff. But even up until through the war period, like both wars and through the 20th century, the whole organization mainly just dealt with Jewish refugees and like really not in that great of numbers. And a lot of them just went to Israel and shit. So at least according to their website, it said that it only started to deal with other like non-Jewish refugees in the 2000s. So honestly, I'm just gonna take the stretch, and it doesn't seem that big of a leap to say that they haven't really been that big in terms of refugee resettlement and immigration relief and stuff. I think they've definitely contributed, and we'll see that. I'm gonna go and list a couple of refugee orgs that the Office of Refugee Resettlement lists, and they're on that list. So I mean, I think they definitely contribute. If you look at the resettlement agencies that are listed by the Office of Refugee Resettlement's website, it's a .gov website. It lists HIAS along with like 7 other agencies, and obviously there are other volunteer NGO agencies that like work with refugees and immigrants and stuff. But these are just the ones that the Refugee Resettlement Office lists. So I guess they're the most prominent. That's kind of subjective. It's hard to get numbers on like every single like stats for every single agency and like totally compare. But anyway, most of the other agencies seem to be Christian based, or at least started by Christians. And then I will say the International Rescue Committee was technically created by Albert Einstein, apparently. So if you really want to count that, I guess you could, but that's definitely like a secular organization. Like it's not specifically Jewish. So the only specifically Jewish one is HIAS, and for like most of its history, it only dealt with Jewish refugees, either from Europe, bringing them to the States, or in like the Middle East and stuff. And usually those types of Jews went to Israel. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. And just want to real quick go into the history of the Office of Refugee Resettlement. It's the first like standardized government agency to deal with refugees coming to the U.S. And that was established under the Refugee Act of 1980. And this act was passed under the Carter administration and introduced by Ed Kennedy. So again, like another Kennedy thing. But before this act, there were like specific acts passed. The other acts before the Refugee Act of 1980 were just specific acts, mainly dealing with like isolated incidents, like post-war years, just certain events like Cubans, Haitians, whatnot. But this act was the one that actually like established a permanent agency to deal with refugees. And we'll see later on in the video certain groups and figures who like helped push this through and whatnot. But I just want to give that all as like a brief history of refugee stuff. And then I'm just going to, for the rest of the video, I'm just going to talk mainly about the Catholic Church, but also the Evangelical Church broadly and how they viewed the situation with immigration and refugees. This is not to criticize Christians or anything like that. And to be honest, it's pretty like obvious and clear like that helping refugees and helping immigrants is just a reflection of like Christian biblical values. That just makes the most sense to me. I think there are some ulterior motives that we can get into if you want to be like conspiratorial about it. I just give them the benefit of a doubt and say that they're just trying to be like charitable and do acts of Christian charity. They also, I think, undoubtedly have done more than the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and like any Jewish religious organization has in like importing refugees and importing immigrants, which is quite obvious because there's just way more Christians in the country. I mean, it just makes the most sense. It is the most clear-cut explanation for that. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so I'm going to be starting off with the Catholic Church. I'm going to mainly be using the book Refuge in the Lord by Lawrence J. McAndrews. This is a good book. It just goes from like the 80s, from like Reagan, a little bit of Jimmy Carter, to Reagan to like the Obama years. I think that's a good timeline because the previous video I went up until 65. So I'll try to cover like those in between years, but just go through to somewhat of the present, I guess. First, we could start with the Cuban immigrants and refugees who came after the Cuban Revolution. This started in the late 50s, ran into the early 60s. with hundreds of thousands of Cubans going to Florida mainly. And it's difficult to say that it was necessarily like a Catholic or a Christian thing that like had them all come over. It was more just like a political thing with Fidel Castro, and the Cubans who came over were mostly even like kind of like light-skinned Cubans and ideologically geared more towards like anti-communism. And I mean, the U.S. government like let them come in. It was not like a illegal thing at all. This is where you get the term gusano from. If people ever call a Cuban that, it means they're like a more like white, upper class. At least they were, like their family was in Cuba. Anyway, but the Catholic Church and other evangelical organizations definitely helped in like resettling and like rehoming some of the refugees. Specifically, I want to point out a specific operation called Operation Peter Pan, where roughly 14,000 children from Cuba were sent over to the U.S. by Cuban parents, and they were basically they were under the Catholic Church's care and like rehomed and stuff in the U.S. And we see like more later on, more Cubans like coming over. Sometimes they're referred to as like boat people. Same with Vietnamese people and Haitians, so we'll cover that later too. And speaking of all three groups, Haitians and Cubans, mainly Catholic, and then even Vietnamese from like refugees from the Vietnam War, like a substantial minority of Vietnamese are also Catholic, so that's something to keep in mind. And just to put some numbers on it, in 1965 alone, there was 85,000 Cubans, and the majority of them were resettled by the National Catholic Welfare Conference and Catholic Relief Services. A little bit was also done by the Protestant Church World Service as well. If we move on a little later to the end of the Vietnam War, that's when we start seeing a lot of Southeast Asian immigrants, or more or less refugees, to the United States. And to put some numbers on that, in 1964, only 603 Vietnamese were living in the U.S., and by 1985, there was over 600,000. From 1975 to 1980, Church and State resettled almost 400,000 refugees, with one Catholic working for the National Catholic News Service, calling it the high point in cooperation between the Catholic Church and the Ford administration. And we can see this with support from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. There's various quotes and statements from high-ranking officials in that organization and bishops who either wrote to Ford or were directly involved in advisory committees on refugees in the administration. Even Ford had a meeting with the Pope and they discussed the issue. And so while the hierarchy of the Catholic Church was more or less pro-refugee, the average Catholic wasn't. And you see that time and time again with like the average person in the U.S. probably is like pretty anti-immigration and is just kind of skeptical of refugee resettlement and all that stuff, which is like pretty understandable just coming from an average person. But that didn't really affect what the hierarchy thought. And again, that's understandable because they are not necessarily bound to, they're not politicians. I mean, the Catholic Church is not a political organization. At least its main goal and focus is not that. So, and even regular politicians don't always listen to polls. So it's not that surprising. And going back to evangelicals, we see that they played a pretty significant role at the actual resettlement camps that were set up in the U.S. They were tasked with, or not really tasked, I mean, they chose to do a lot of the Americanization, like education programs at the camps. And this is for the obvious reason of trying to like evangelize to the Vietnamese, whether they were like had their own traditional Vietnamese religion or they were Catholic. I mean, an evangelical is going to look at that as a opportunity to evangelize. So we see them in charge of a lot of education and also resettlement as well, because obviously the refugees can't just stay in camps forever. So, and just real quick, I guess I'm kind of intermingling Protestant and Catholic. The book I'm using for the evangelical response is The Strangers in Our Midst by Ulrike Stockhausen, I believe it's called. American Evangelicals and Immigration from the Cold War to the 21st Century. And this book mainly only goes over like the Southern Baptist Convention and like a couple other denominations. It doesn't really cross like the whole gamut of like mainline Protestants. It doesn't even give like the full picture really. But it's also kind of interesting because it varies among Protestants, denominations, what their response to refugees and immigrants are, because Protestants are such a varied group and not like as hierarchical and don't have like a single authority. So each denomination, each even individual church, if you go down to like the Baptist, like, independent fundamentalist Baptist churches, they all have their own thing going on. So it really just depended on what church and what denomination, but more or less they were all pretty, at least, into like the charity aspect of refugees and immigrants. And you can see some antecedents within the Catholic Church itself. in regards to refugees and like immigration and stuff. Various popes made like different, I don't know about all the terminology, but like I guess you'd say like encyclicals or like statements, such as Exsul Familia, Refugee Family in 1952, Christus Dominus, Christ the Lord in the Second Vatican Council, Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, Instructions on the Pastoral Care of People Who Migrate in 1967, Laborum Exercens of Human Work. So all of these encyclicals were listed, not virtue signaling or anything, but just saying like, we care for the poor, we care for refugees, immigrants, everyone has like rights, God-given rights, whatnot, and that governments should either Catholics or governments. I mean, really anyone with a conscience should help them out. So that just gives like papal backing to, like, obviously the Pope isn't going to say like, oh, screw refugees, like it's kind of obvious. But again, because it's a hierarchical organization, like what the Pope says does reach down to like bishops say, and the bishops in the U.S. are going to follow that lead. In terms of the 1980 Refugee Act under Carter, the 80 Refugee Act was mainly in response to 1968, the U.S. signing the UN protocol relating to the status of refugees. And so this was just Carter's attempt to try and like formalize that, I guess you could say. But the Catholic hierarchy was on board with this, and in 1976, Archbishop Robert Sanchez of Santa Fe testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee in favor of the UN adoption of like the definition of a refugee. So I'm not really gonna blame that all on like Catholic Church. Obviously, that's just like part of being part of the UN and whatnot. But the Catholic Church did approve, and they used this act as a way to embrace like Catholic Haitians and Cubans coming in 1980, because there were still Cubans coming from Cuba, obviously because of Castro, and Haitians at the time were fleeing a dictatorship, and the Haitian community would be more in flux in terms of legality as opposed to the Cubans. The Cuban refugees were more or less accepted and legalized and like seen as refugees, but the Haitians, it was a little less so. But we do see in the Simpson-Mazzoli bill in 1986 that they were more or less legalized if they came before 1980. And there's honestly always like a flux of Haitians like trickling over. So it's just like a constant kind of thing with presidents and the Catholic Church advocating for them. And they're not like so many that it's like a huge deal, but it's worth a mention. And just to give more numbers, since 1975, the USCC had aided almost half the refugees admitted to the US, and in 1981 alone would resettle 58,000. And in 1981, the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy, otherwise known as the Hezberg Commission, was released and sent to Congress under Father Hezberg. This commission more or less advocated for higher immigration ceilings, as well as amnesty for Cubans and Haitians who came before 1980. And yeah, more or less was just pro-immigration. You can read more about it. I'll post a summary of it. But this commission influenced the Simpson-Mazzoli bill that was discussed earlier, which gave the first amnesty to mainly Latino immigrants, but also Cubans and Haitians. And the logic, or I guess like the after effects of the Hezberg Commission, even influenced the 1990 Bush bill, which also raised like immigration caps, I would say pretty solidly, from the Cuban exiles to Southeast Asians, then to amnesty. The Catholic Church played a pretty big role. But even with both the 86 bills and the 90 bill, the church hierarchy was pretty. They liked that, it increased, or that the 86 bill gave amnesty, but they didn't like that it put more restrictive policies on hiring practices. And then the 90 bill, it increased immigration, but it didn't do much for like illegal immigration. And the Catholic hierarchy didn't like that. They just generally wanted the most immigration possible. And you can kind of see why, that a pretty significant number of Catholics in the country are Hispanic. And you can even see polling that shows that Hispanics are 1/3 of American Catholics and tend to show a higher propensity to identify as Catholics and be more church-going. And one archbishop said as much, saying, "One thing immigrants do for the American Catholic Church is they enrich the church." And president of the Catholic University of America said, "They're keeping the Catholic Church fresh and the church is full." So I'm not saying that's the main reason, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was definitely in the back of the minds of some Catholic leaders. Also during this time in the 80s, the sanctuary movement came to be. This was because there was a lot of Latinos coming to the U.S. escaping violent governments in Central America. And one of the leading members or founders was Pastor John Fife, who was a Presbyterian. But Catholics and Jews also supported it. And even a proto form of this movement started with the Mennonite Church. And this is something I didn't know, but apparently the Mennonite Church, even back in the 1930s, had Latino members. They were called the Meno-Latinos, and founded the Concilio Nacional de Iglesias Menonitas Hispanas in the early 1970s. And many of these people were kind of like proto sanctuary movement people and were activists for the immigrant cause. And evangelicals from World Relief were also active in advocating for the 1986 amnesty bill as a kind of a counterpart to the sanctuary movement. So yeah, 80s to 90s, pretty like a lot of pro-immigrant stuff. But we see with Bill Clinton in 1996, the first act in quite a while that dealt more kind of like harshly with immigration. So in 96, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act is passed under Clinton. It basically just cracked down harder on illegal immigration and made deportations and stuff like that more easily accessible. Both Protestant and Catholic groups protested against this, with both the Catholic Legal Immigrant Network Clinic and the Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service and the Florence Immigration Refugee Project creating a conference called Open Wide the Doors. So that was their little protest against that. We even have the Jesuit magazine, America, writing about how the immigration, illegal or legal, of Mexicans into the U.S. is basically a peaceful reversal of the U.S. annexation of California in 1848. And in 2000, bishops, along with the AFL-CIO head John Sweeney, another Irish Catholic, teamed up to fix 96 in an attempt to repeal the 96 law. And around this time, a little bit before, the Catholic bishops came out with their immigration position entitled One Family Under God, basically advocating for like liberal immigration policies and family reunification. And then in 2003, Strangers No Longer, Together on the Journey of Hope, both American and Mexican bishops advocated for like amnesty and legalized immigration. And I'm not saying any of that worked to actually like repeal the law or anything, just showing like a general trend. And then obviously after Clinton with Bush and the war on terror, 9/11, that puts more of a immigration isn't so much as in the spotlight, but also there's kind of fears of terrorism, so it's also somewhat more restricted at that time. This does lead to some Catholic leaders urging Bush to increase refugee caps, keeping in mind that about a fifth of all refugees in the past or previous 50 years from the Bush administration had been resettled by Catholic agencies. That's about 1 million. And in the Obama years, you have movements like Nuns on the Bus who went on like tours and advocated for immigration reform, among other things. I'm not going to delve too deep onto the Bush and Obama years just because it's like too recent for my taste. And I think there was like a lot of other things going on anyway. But just to leave off with some quotes, we have Ed Koch, who's a Jewish mayor of New York from 78 to 89, said that two women welcomed the immigrants, Lady Liberty and Mother Church, in regards to immigrants and refugees. And Frank Moynihan, or Monahan, who headed the Bishops' Conference Government Liaison Office, saying that the Bishops' Conference has a unique role in this town, talking about Washington, D.C., and that the church has a well-developed set of social policies and a history of dealing with those policies that's highly respected, and that we're the largest religion, there are so many Catholics, blah, blah, blah. So essentially just saying that the Catholic Church has influence, obviously, on the government. I bring up those quotes just because people quote a lot of like random stuff on the internet sometimes, which A, the quotes might not even be accurate, or B, they're just like random quotes about like Jewish influence and stuff, so I thought I'd throw those in there. So I just think it's pretty clear when you actually compare mainly the Catholic Church, but also the Christian Church, and I didn't even do like a full in-depth, I mean, I could do way more on the Catholic Church and obviously way more on the Protestant churches in general, but I don't think the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society holds a candle to like any of these church groups, and it just makes the most sense because Highest mainly focused on Jewish refugees and is also way smaller. So yeah, the point of this video was just to look at the actual like church organizations and stuff. And I want to point out real quick that Tree of Life synagogue shooter apparently was like super obsessed on the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And my one question is, why is there no consistency if people are so worried about Jews and like pushing immigration or whatever nonsense? Why aren't they consistent and also look to the Christian churches? That's not advocating anything. That's not condoning anything. But I'm just saying there seems to be like a really big lack of consistency. I think it's mainly because a lot of these people have Christian backgrounds, so they just like either say they're Christian or they think Christianity is like a vehicle for like the white race or something. But I think it should be consistent. You'd have to admit that the Catholic and Christian churches in general are pretty have a pretty big hand in reducing the white population. I'm not saying, me personally, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying it's good. I'm not telling anyone to do anything, but I just think there's a very big lack of consistency among certain far right groups with this and like plenty of other issues and topics. So, but that's my video. Hope you enjoyed it. And next, I'm going to be doing a video on Jews in the Soviet Union Secret Service. So, see you then.